Section 8 of The Brain and the Voice in Speech and Song by F. W. Mott. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Maria James. The primary revival of some sensations in the brain. I have on page 77 referred to Stricker's views on the primary revival of words in the sense of movement of the lips and tongue. Mach, Analysis of the Sensations, says, the supposition that the processes in the larynx during singing have had something to do with the formation of the tonal series I noticed in one of my earlier publications, but did not find it tenable. Singing is connected in too extrinsic and accidental a manner with hearing to bear out such a hypothesis. I can hear and imagine tones far beyond the range of my own voice. In listening to an orchestral performance with all the parts, or in having a hallucination of such a performance, it is impossible for me to think that my understanding of this broad and complicated sound fabric has been affected by my one larynx, which is, moreover, no very practiced singer. I consider the sensations which in listening to singing are doubtless occasionally noticed in the larynx a matter of subsidiary importance, like the pictures of the keys touched, which, when I was more in practice, sprang up immediately into my imagination on hearing a performance on the piano or organ. When I imagine music, I always distinctly hear the notes. Music can no more come into being merely through the motor sensations accompanying musical performances than a deaf man can hear by watching the movements of the players. I therefore cannot agree with Stricker on this point. Close quote. Camp Stricker, Du langage et de la musique, Paris, 1885. Of the motor type myself, and having a fairly good untrained ear for music, I find that to memorize a melody, whether played by an instrument or by an orchestra, I must either try to sing or hum that melody in order to fix it in my memory. Every time I do this, association processes are being set up in the brain between the auditory centers and the centers of phonation, and when I try to revive in my silent thoughts the melody again, I do so best by humming aloud a few bars of the melody to start the revival, and then continuing the revival by maintaining the resonator in the position of humming the tune, viz. With closed lips, so that the sound waves can only escape through the nose. Under such circumstances, the only definite conscious muscular sensation I have is from the effect of closure of the lips. The sensations from the larynx are either non-existent or quite ill-defined, although I hear mentally the tonal sensations of the melody. No doubt by closing the lips in silent humming, I am in some way concentrating attention to the sensory motor sphere of phonation and articulation, and by reactive association with the auditory sphere, reinforcing the tonal sensations in the mind. The vocal cords, ligaments themselves, contain very few nerve fibers. Those that are seen in the deeper structures of the cords and adjacent parts mainly proceed to the mucous glands. This fact, which I have ascertained by numerous careful examinations, is in accordance with the fact that there are no conscious kinesthetic impressions of alterations of position and tension of the vocal cords. A comparative microscopic examination of the tip of the tongue and the lips shows a remarkable difference, for these structures are beset with innumerable sensory nerves, whereby every slightest alteration of tension and minute variations in degree of pressure of the covering skin is associated with messages thereon to the brain. The sense of movement in articulate speech is therefore explained by this fact. There is every reason, then, to believe that auditory tonal images are the sole primary and essential guides to the minute alterations of tension in the muscles of the larynx necessary for the production of corresponding vocal sounds. By humming a tune, we concentrate our attention and thereby limit the activity of neural processes to the systems and communities of neurons employed for the perception of tonal images and their activation in motor processes, and this helps to fix the tune in the memory. Psychic mechanism of the voice. A musical speaking voice denotes generally a good singing voice, And it must be remembered that articulation cannot be separated from phonation in the psychic mechanism. In speaking, we are unconscious of the breath necessary for the production of the voice. Not so, however, in effective singing, the management of the breathing being of fundamental importance, and it is no exaggeration to say that only the individual who knows how to breathe knows how to sing effectually. A musical ear and sense of rhythm are innate in some individuals. In others they are not innate and can only be acquired to a variable degree of perfection by persevering efforts and practice. The most intelligent persons may never be able to sing in tune, or even time. The latter, sense of rhythm, is much more easily acquired by practice than the former, correct intonation. This is easily intelligible, for rhythmical movement appertains also to speech and other acts of human beings, e.g. walking, dancing, running, swimming, etc. Moreover, rhythmical periodicity characterizes the beat of the heart and respiration. But how does a trained singer learn to sing a song or to take part in an opera? He has to study the performances of two parts for the vocal instrument, the part written by the composer and the part written by the poet or dramatist, and in order to present an artistic rendering, the intellectual and emotional characters of each part must be blended in a harmonious combination. A singer will first read the words and understand their meaning, then memorize them, so that the whole attention subsequently may be given to applying the musical part to them and employing with proper phrasing, which means more than knowing when to breathe. It means imparting expression and feeling. A clever actor or orator can, if he possess a high degree of intelligence and a fairly artistic temperament, so modulate his voice as to convey to his audience the passions and emotions while feeling none of them himself. So many great singers who are possessed of a good musical ear, a good memory, and natural intelligence, although lacking in supreme artistic temperament and conspicuous musical ability, are nevertheless able to interpret by intonation and articulation the passions and emotions which the composer has expressed in his music, and the poet or dramatist in his words. The intelligent artist, possessed of the musical ear, the sense of rhythm, and a well-formed vocal organ, accomplishes this by the conscious control and management of his breathing muscles and the muscles of articulation, which by education and imitation he has brought under complete control of the will. With him, visual symbols of musical notes are associated with the visual symbols of words in the mind, and the visual symbols, whether of the words or of the musical notes, will serve to revive in memory the sound of the one or the other, or of both. But he produces that sound by alteration of tension in coordinated groups of muscles necessary for vocalization, viz. The muscles of phonation in the larynx, the muscles of articulation in the tongue, lips, jaw, and palate, and the muscles of costal respiration. The mind of the orator, actor, and dramatic singer exercises a profound influence upon the respiratory system of nerves, and thereby produces the necessary variations in the force, continuance, and volume of air required for vocal expression. Sir Charles Bell, who discovered the respiratory system of nerves, pointed out how the lungs, from being in the lower animals merely the means of oxygenating the blood, become utilized in the act of expelling air from the body for the production of audible sounds, the elements of human voice and speech. Likewise, he drew attention to the influence which powerful emotions exercise upon the organ of respiration, including the countenance, e.g., the dilated nostrils in anger. Again, quote, "When the voice suffers interruption and falters, and the face, neck, and chest are animated by strong passion working from within the breast, language exerts its most commanding influence." Close quote. In hemiplegia, or paralysis of one half of the body, there is a difference between the two sides for ordinary, automatic, unconscious diaphragmatic breathing and voluntary or costal breathing. Thus, in ordinary breathing, the movements are increased on the paralyzed side, especially in the upper part of the chest, while in voluntary breathing they are increased on the sound side. Hewlings-Jackson suggested the following theory to explain these facts. Quote, ordinary breathing is an automatic act governed by the respiratory center in the medulla. The respiratory center is double, each side being controlled or inhibited by higher centers on the opposite side of the brain. Voluntary costal breathing, such as is employed in singing, is of cerebral origin and controlled by centers on the opposite side of the brain, the impulses being sent down to the respective centers for the associated movements of the muscles of articulation, phonation, and breathing. In the same way as they are sent to the centers for the movements of the arm or leg. With voluntary breathing, the respiratory center in the medulla has nothing to do. It is in fact out of gear or inhibited for the time being, so that the impulses from the brain pass by or evade it. There are thus two sets of respiratory nerve fibers passing from the brain, the one inhibiting or controlling to the opposite half of the respiratory center in the medulla, the other direct, evading the respiratory center and running the same course to the spinal centers for the respiratory movements, as the ordinary motor fibers do to the centers for other movements. Both sets would be affected by the lesion or damage which produced the hemiplegia. The inhibitory fibers being damaged, the opposite half of the respiratory center would be under diminished control, and therefore the movements of ordinary breathing on the paralyzed side would be exaggerated. The damage to the direct fibers would prevent the passage of voluntary stimuli to the groups of respiratory muscles, as it would do to the rest of the muscles of the paralyzed side, and thus the voluntary movement of respiration would be diminished only and not completely abolished as in the limbs, because according to the theory of Broadbent, in the case of such closely associated bilateral movements, the lower nervous respiratory centers of both sides would be activated from either side of the brain. Close quote. This certainly applies also to the muscles of phonation, but not to the principal muscles of articulation, viz. The tongue and lips. It is not exactly known what part of the cerebral cortex controls the associated movements necessary for voluntary costal rib respiration in singing. Probably it is localized in the frontal lobe in front of that part, stimulation of which gives rise to trunk movements. Whatever its situation, it must be connected by association fibers with the centers of phonation and articulation. Experiments on animals and observations on human beings show that the centers presiding over the muscles of the larynx are situated one in each hemisphere at the lower end of the ascending frontal convolution in close association with that of the tongue, lips, and jaw. This is as we should expect, for they form a part of the whole cerebral mechanism which presides over the voice in speech and song. But because the muscles of the tongue, the lower face muscles, and even the muscles of the jaw do not necessarily and always work synchronously and similarly on the two sides, there is more independence in their representation in the cerebral cortex. Consequently, a destruction of this region of the brain, or the fibers which proceed from it, to the lower executive bulbar and spinal centers is followed by paralysis of the muscles of the opposite side. Likewise, stimulation with an interrupted electric current applied to this region of the brain in monkeys by suitable electrodes produces movements of the muscles of the lips, tongue, and jaw of the opposite side only. Not so, however, stimulation of the region which presides over the movements of the muscles of the larynx, for then both vocal cords are drawn together and made tense as in phonation. It is therefore not surprising if one removal or destruction of this portion of the brain on one side does not produce paralysis of the muscles of phonation, which, always bilaterally associated in their actions, are represented as a bilateral group in both halves of the brain. These centers may be regarded as a part of the physiological mechanism, but the brain acts as a whole in the psychic mechanism of speech and song. From these facts, it appears that there is 1. An automatic mechanism for respiration and elemental phonation, the cry, in the medulla oblongata, which can act independently of the higher centers in the brain, and even without them. 2. A cerebral conscious voluntary mechanism which controls phonation, either alone or associated with articulation. The opening of the glottis by contraction of the abductor, posterior ring pyramid muscles, is especially associated with the descent of the diaphragm in inspiration in ordinary breathing, whereas the voluntary breathing in singing is associated with contraction of the adductor and tensor muscles of the vocal cords. A perfect psychic mechanism is as necessary as the physiological mechanism for the production of perfect vocalization, especially for dramatic singing. A person, on the one hand, may be endowed with a grand vocal organ, but be a failure as a singer on account of incorrect intonation, of uncertain rhythm, or imperfect diction. On the other hand, a person only endowed with a comparatively poor vocal instrument, but knowing how to use it to the best advantage, is able to charm his audience. Incapable of vigorous sound production, he makes up for lack of power by correct phrasing and emotional expression. We see then that the combination of a perfect physiological and psychological mechanism is essential for successful dramatic singing, the chief attributes of which are 1. Control of the breath, adequate volume, sustaining power, equality in the force of expulsion of air to avoid an unpleasant vibrato, and capability of producing and sustaining loud or soft tones throughout the register. 2. Compass or range of voice not less than 2 octaves with adequate control by mental perception of the sounds of the necessary variation in tension of the laryngeal muscles for correct intonation. 3. Rich quality or timbre, due partly to the construction of the resonator, but in great measure to its proper use under the control of the will. Something is lacking in a performance, however perfect the vocalization as regards intonation and quality, if it fails to arouse enthusiasm or to stir up the feelings of an audience by the expression of passion or sentiment through the mentality of the singer. The general public are becoming educated in music and are beginning to realize that shouting 2 or 3 high-pitched chest notes does not constitute dramatic singing. Quote, a short beau moment does not compensate for a mauvais quart d'heure. Close quote. It would be hard to describe or define the qualities that make a voice appeal to the multitude. Different singers with a similar timbre of voice and register may sing the same song correctly in time, rhythm, and phrasing, and yet only one of them may produce that sympathetic quality necessary to awaken not only the intellectual, but the affective side of the mind of the hearers. Undoubtedly, the effects produced upon the mind by dramatic song largely depend upon circumstances and surroundings, also upon association of ideas. Thus, I was never more stirred emotionally by the human voice than upon hearing a mad Frenchman sing at my request the Marseillaise. Previously, when talking to him, his eyes had lacked luster, and his physiognomy was expressionless. But when this broad-chested, 6-foot, burly, black-bearded maniac rolled out in a magnificent, full-chested baritone voice, the song that has stirred the emotions and passions of millions to their deepest depth, and aroused in some hope, in others despair, as he made the building ring with Ô psaumes, citoyens, formez vos bataillons. I felt an emotional thrill down the spine and a gulp in the throat, while the heart and respirations for an instant stayed in their rhythmical course. Not only was I stirred by the effect of the sounds heard, but by the change in the personality of the singer. It awakened in my mind the scenes in the French Revolution so vividly described by Carlyle. The man's facial expression and whole personality suddenly appeared changed. He planted his foot firmly on the ground, striking the attitude of a man carrying a musket, a flag, or a pike. His eyes gleamed with fire, and the lackluster expression had changed to one of delirious excitement. A pike in his hand and a red cap on his head would have completed the picture of a sans-culotte. Dramatic song, therefore, that does not evoke an emotional response is vox et praeterea nihil. End of section 8. End of The Brain and the Voice in Speech and Song by F.W. Mott. Recording by Maria James, The Glorious Midwest, USA, December 2020.